Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, the faculty director at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Kennedy School. We're delighted that both the Carr Center and the David Rockefeller Center on Latin American Studies are co-hosting this event today, which features Sergio Jaramillo, the High Commissioner for Peace of the Republic of Colombia. Let me tell you how we've structured this hour and a half. We welcome to the Kennedy School a friend and colleague of the Commissioner, Professor Jim Robinson. Jim is going to take a few minutes to frame the more than half-century history of this conflict for those who may not know much, and then he's going to introduce the Commissioner. Jim is the David Florence Professor of Government at Harvard, and in 2012 was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So we're very pleased to have him as a colleague. Then Commissioner Jaramillo will speak. We said for about 30 minutes, he said for about 45 minutes, about the negotiations between the government and guerrillas in Colombia, which are taking place in Cuba. So this will be a subject of negotiation, and hopefully Professor Kesley Hong will be part of that negotiation. We're very pleased to have her reflect on the Commissioner's comments as someone who thinks both theoretically and practically about negotiations, and might say we're particularly pleased that she deemed it important enough to bring her class here. So welcome to all of you, as well as Colombian students and others of the Colombian community who've come to join us today. Kesley is a graduate of Harvard through and through, from her BA to her MPA to her PhD. So we're going to get the true vision of Harvard education here. So you all know what to aspire from by her very good modeling. So Kesley's going to speak immediately after the Commissioner, and that was your introduction. So, and following the commentary, we hope to have as much time as possible, but at least 15 minutes for some give and take and questions.
A long history of negotiation with the FARC going back until the early 1980s, and I couldn't hope to characterize that, but let me tell you one anecdote about the Navy, which may give you, those of you who don't know about this, a sense of what that was like. For a long time during the government of President Pastrana, there was a negotiation with the FARC in Caquetá in the southeast of Colombia, and Lucho Garzón, who was the former mayor of Bogotá, was very involved in these negotiations, and he was a former quite left-wing chap who became more moderate, and once he told me the story, he was at the negotiation. This story is to kind of illustrate how the negotiations might not have been quite what people aspired. He was in the negotiation, he went to the bathroom, and as he went into the bathroom, he was followed by a FARC member of the FARC, and he thought, oh, gosh, they're going to kill me. And the chap came up behind him and whispered in his ear, "When are we going to take Bogotá, comrade?" So this in the midst of the negotiation for peace and transition, and so I think that suggests something which was, very characteristic of many previous negotiations, which was, it was a very strategic thing without a real commitment to changing, stopping the armed conflict, changing the society, integrating into the society, and kind of envisaging a different Colombia. So I think that there's a possibility of that happening, and there's nobody better to talk about that than Sergio. He and I met, I guess, about 10 years ago for the first time when he was director of the think tank Ideas para la Paz, which has been an enormous voice of kind of sanity and clarity over the issues in Colombia over the peace and what needs to happen and what could happen, and imagining different futures over the last 10 years. After that, he was Vice Minister of Defense. During the Uribe government, he was very involved in the attempt of strengthening the state and extending the reach of the state. Some of you may know about the National Consolidation Plan, which was sort of a brainchild of his, which was an attempt to kind of civilianize the strategy of the Uribe government and take it beyond just a military reconquest, but into a real reconstruction of the authority and legitimacy of the state in rural areas. And I mention that just to show you the kind of breadth of the vision that I think is kind of necessary to stop the peace. It's not just about, you know, putting the guns underground and getting some Canadians to monitor them, or getting the FARC to turn into a political party. The FARC is a sort of facet or an outcome of a much broader kind of dysfunctionality of Colombian politics and society and the state. And so all of that has to be addressed in order for there to be real peace. And just to end by going back to structural, you know, causes, and how one, you know, this is a moment not to dwell on structural causes. You know, in the book I wrote, I talk a lot about critical junctures, you know, about moments where there's a sort of possibility to overcome structural causes and move in a different direction. And I could perhaps end, this will be something that will surprise him, you know, if he watches the video, I could perhaps end by quoting the title of President Uribe's autobiography, No Lost Causes. So I think this is really a moment to think that no lost causes and what's possible and what will it take to build a new Colombia. So we're very happy to have Sergio talk about that.
Many, many thanks to the Carr Center for the invitation, to the Rockefeller Center, to Jim for kindly putting this together a little bit at the last minute, taking advantage of a visit to the US. And thank you all for coming, for your interest and your patience. More than talking about the details about Havana, I wanted to use this occasion to explain a little bit the vision of the government that's behind this peace process. And I think it's particularly appropriate to talk about the peace process here at the Carr, because the approach of the Colombian government and the approach of President Santos to peace is precisely a rights-based approach, in the sense, certainly, that it's about addressing victims' rights, but also in the larger sense that a goal of the process, and perhaps the main goal of the process, is to increase and extend our capacity to protect and guarantee constitutional rights of all Colombians, especially of those in conflict-afflicted areas. Now, it's impossible to talk about rights if you don't talk about institutions, about the institutions that are going to guarantee those rights and deliver the goods, beginning with the basic right to life and personal integrity. And I mean here institutions, not just in this Colombian sense of institutions as some kind of bureaucratic apparatus, but also institutions in the sense of a capacity to produce public goods, to regulate social life, to establish certain practices and norms that are observed by all. The problem, of course, is that if you have a conflict, even if it's one that has receded to the regions, as has happened in Colombia today, you inevitably have some form of institutional failure, both in the sense in your capacity to deliver those public goods, and also in that second aspect, your capacity to create conditions for political demands to be debated and processed without recourse to violence. Now, these points are at the heart of the two agreements we have reached already with the FARC, and I will talk about them later on. But my point now is the obvious one, that institutions don't grow on trees. They are the product of human agency, of a certain history. So the great challenge for us now is to see how we're going to build the institutions that are going to guarantee a long-lasting peace on the ground and guarantee those rights. And we want to do that in a way which is not doing what we've always done and do more of the same, but to redress the effects of 50 years of conflict and to move Colombia, to move the country into the future. And that is what the Colombian government is engaged in, not simply to demobilize the FARC, as Jim said, but to put in place a process that is actually going to change things on the ground. And in our view, the only way to go about this is to have what we call a territorial approach. to think the problem in territorial, regional, and local terms. And that is because, first, you need to, you want to coordinate all the various measures, all the various agreements you've reached, whether you're talking about development or transitional justice or DDR. You want to make sure that all of those things happen in a way which reinforce each other in a certain place. So you need to be able to have an overview of that and a way of coordinating that. But also in the sense, perhaps even more interestingly, that you want to mobilize the population around that common purpose of peace building and make people feel that they are actors and participants of change. In the end, what you're trying to do is to strengthen, to re-establish, perhaps to some extent, establish for the first time in certain regions of Colombia, a public sphere within which all of this can happen. And if you do that, you can start solving what is perhaps the fundamental problem for us. We don't want to overuse the word structural, but perhaps the fundamental structural problem, which is this urban-rural divide, and how to bridge that in the context of peace. And that, this approach, this territorial approach, this integrated approach with a comprehensive view, with a population that is mobilized around a common joint peace-building purpose, and with an effort to build bridges between the rural areas and the cities around that purpose, that is what I call the idea of territorial peace, and that's what I want to talk about mostly today. But before I go on, let me, although I know there are many Colombians in the audience to my say hello, I want to remind you briefly of some basic facts you shouldn't forget, such as that the Colombian conflict is one of the major internal conflicts left in the world. It has gone on for about, depends how you count, but at least 50 years. It is certainly, it's the only remaining major conflict in the Western Hemisphere. The number of victims has been enormous. Millions and millions of displaced people, hundreds of thousands of dead, tens of thousands of people have been kidnapped or even forcefully disappeared, and so on. And again, it is true, as you all know, that Colombia is now quite a different country. Colombia is prospering. The conflict has receded, but its effects have not. We're still suffering from the effects of 50 years of conflict, and obviously the presence of the conflict in certain regions of the country. And the second thing I wanted to emphasize at the beginning is that we do have here what I call a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And this is what I think, after having been speaking to the FARC now for 2 years in Havana, I think we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to find a path to peace, certainly the best opportunity we have ever had. And we want to do this in a way which is not simply, again, making sure that, as we say in Spanish, that the rightfuls are silent, but that there is a productive solution for the country. It's a productive solution for Colombians. Let me give you, for those who don't know, for those who are in the negotiating class, a super brief summary of how we've got where we are. This got going really from the very beginning of President Santos' administration. He mentioned in his inauguration speech in August 2010, to the surprise of many people, that he used an expression in Spanish saying that the key to peace has not been lost, and nobody had talked about peace for a long time then. And then what happened is that we started, I was then myself, President Santos brought me to the government as a national security advisor, but I will also have the functions of what is called in Colombia the peace commissioner, that is the person that legally can actually do all this stuff. And so we had a very good and important back channel to the FARC. So we started a kind of standard toing and froing of messages and things, and we agreed to have a meeting under the conditions that it had to be direct, it had to be secret, and it had to happen abroad somewhere. And it took quite a long time to negotiate the terms of that. You can imagine the level of distrust, especially with a guerrilla like the FARC, and there were very many security considerations, guarantees. So it took actually a long time to negotiate the terms of that meeting. But finally, by February 2012, we met for the first time in Havana in secret. All of this was new in Colombia. Things had not been done that way before. And we started a process of secret negotiations that soon had the established aim of reaching what we called a framework agreement, an agreement that would establish very clearly what this process would be about, what issues we would discuss, under what rules. That was very, very intense. I led the government side. We literally would sit in a house in Havana around a table with blackboards, and interestingly, for those who are interested in negotiation, we started with the most difficult issues, which were the issues of DDR and weapons. And contrary to what some people say, started with the easy thing, it was very important that we started with the hardest thing, because once that was clear, we could move on to the rest. And we also established a method, which is quite counterintuitive if you know the history of negotiations with the FARC, of working around what we call a single text, writing on boards, making proposals, much as I suppose diplomats would do, and all of that method became very much the basis that allowed us to reach that first agreement. And once we reached that first agreement in August 2012, then this was made public. The president gave a big speech. There had been rumors around, of course. Colombia is a very media-driven country, so there were rumors that something was going on, but miraculously the whole thing had not leaked. And so there was a lot of surprise. And then the process, the public phase, started in Oslo in October, and we've been at it since then, again in Havana, in a much more formal setting with new people joining and reinforcing both delegations. And what we started to do was to actually develop that framework agreement. So once the field had been set, and the issue was now to put some meat on the bones of that framework agreement. That's what we've been doing for the last year and a half. And in that context, we reached an agreement on agrarian issues and also on political participation. This whole thing has not been easy. It's quite exhausting, but I think we've managed to develop a solid method that is guiding us towards the end. The process is curious if you compare it to others, in that we have no mediation, there's no UN person sitting there writing text. It's all done jointly by both delegations. We only have the presence of some delegates from Cuba and Norway who are kind of silent witnesses. They just sit there and listen. And only very occasionally, when there's some difficulty, some cul-de-sac or occasionally a crisis, do they help outside the room. And the FARC, it has to be said, the FARC have worked seriously, they've worked hard, and we've established a way of communicating with each other and producing results. Now let me move on to the a bit more of the structure and the content of what we are doing. Now the first point that we always repeat, but it is the essential point, is that this process is about ending the armed conflict and agreeing on a number of conditions for a lasting peace. And that may seem like the most obvious idea to anybody who follows peace process negotiations, but it's by no means so obvious in the case of Colombia. We're saying this is actually about ending the armed conflict. That has to be clear from the start. But even more importantly, and that was how we drafted it in the framework agreement, we said that we would start direct and uninterrupted negotiations in order to reach a final agreement that would end the armed conflict and contribute to a long and lasting peace. And then already there you see the seed of the idea that you first end the armed conflict, and then you open up a peace building, or you might call it a transition phase, to build that peace. And the message there is that peace is not signing a deal with the FARC. Peace is what you actually have to start doing once you sign that final agreement. And in a sense, it is true that, strictly speaking, you could say the peace process starts once you sign an agreement with the FARC. Now, what are the conditions that I mentioned for a long and lasting peace? Well, those are the things we agreed in the framework agreement that would come into the agenda because we thought were directly related to the construction of peace. And some people can find that convincing, others arbitrary. In our judgment, those were the things that had to do directly with the possibility of constructing a long and lasting peace. And these are, for those who don't know, 5 substantive points. The first one on rural development, second on political participation, a third one on how the conflict would end, DDR, security guarantees, a fourth on solving the issue of drugs in Colombia, and a fifth on victims and victims' rights. And we've been criticized in Colombia when this whole thing came out, and still we've been criticized, especially by the hard right, for negotiating what they call issues of public policy. And they say one shouldn't do that, one should only discuss those things in parliament in a democratic way or in a democracy. And I myself find this a nice irony here, because they're telling us to resolve in parliament what we haven't been able to resolve in parliament for the last 50 years, precisely for the reason that the hard right has opposed any efforts to have major interventions in the rural areas. Let me nevertheless be clear that the purpose of this process is not to solve all the problems in the country, nor to set all the policies for the country in all areas. But it's my conviction that we need the energy of the peace process to solve a few fundamental issues that are the only ones that are going to guarantee, again, a long and lasting peace. You need to seize the opportunity of peace to solve those problems. And if you think about it, that's not such a strange idea. I was thinking myself, after having read recently a long and quite impressive biography of FDR, you could ask yourself the question whether Roosevelt could have done what he did in terms of regulations, in terms of public works programs, in terms of welfare, without the Depression. That sounds like a very sort of rhetorical question, but in a democracy you need to seize the crisis to bring lasting change. And in a way, that is what we are exactly doing with this process. Now, what is it that we are hoping to change? Well, basically 2 things. The first is to transform the conditions in the rural areas, in the countryside, that have allowed, that have enabled violence to continue for all this time. And the point there is not to get into an academic or philosophical argument about root causes or who's guilty or responsible. It's just simply to recognize in a pragmatic but important way that unless you change those conditions in those areas, the likelihood of violence continuing is very high. But again, it's not just that. You're not just being a pragmatist. You're using this occasion to solve a problem that otherwise you would not have the energy and the resources to do. And in that sense, picking up on what I said at the beginning, in a real sense, the whole process is about guaranteeing people's rights. Because by doing that, you are addressing the rights of all those Colombian citizens that are living in the periphery, in the fringes of Colombia, that don't enjoy the living conditions of those who live in the cities through the peace process. And again, it's not, this is, I will talk about it a little bit more, this is not, we're not being naive, we don't think it's going to happen overnight, but we're going to set a path and a certain number of incentives for this to happen. And that's what we agreed to already in point number 1, which is called, we called with the FARC, a comprehensive rural reform. It's not a 1960s style agrarian reform of simply just distributing land to people and that's it. There is a component of land distribution, we call it comprehensive or integral in Spanish access, which means you don't just distribute land, you do it in the framework of rural development programs that will provide the public goods and the credit lines and so forth for that land to be useful. The other side of that coin of the land distribution is to go for a massive effort at clarifying property rights in the countryside, beginning with the standard procedures of cadastre, registration and so forth, in which Colombia, the Colombian countryside, is to a significant extent still a black hole in that sense, and that is also a source of a lot of violence and illegality. Secondly, we agreed to a number of very ambitious national programs to tailor the provision of those public goods, whether it is health or education or whatever, to the needs of the countryside. Colombia is a country that has been thought and governed from an urban perspective for an urban population, and when we actually look at the details, you notice that we're not successfully providing either health or education to the countryside. And not just that, but infrastructure, obviously, which is the first thing that people ask for, and everything else that you need to make the land productive, credit lines, technical assistance, help with marketing. Again, that sounds like wishful thinking and like a long list, but this actually can be done. There are some recent impressive examples, for example, in Brazil, of government programs that focused, lasered on the needs of the small farmer, and after a few years of intensive help and effort, made them very, very productive and competitive. And the point here is not just to make them productive and competitive, is to include them in the economic life of the country and to stabilize those regions. And you're not just doing it by distributing land, you're doing it by reactivating the economy in the countryside through all of these programs. At the same time, you run, which is sort of something that the Brazilians have done quite successfully, food security programs, not just for those regions, but to bring the benefits of some of that renewed agricultural activity to the poorer areas of the urban world. Again, this all sounds very ambitious, but the point is, this won't happen from one day to the next. It's going to take a long time. It may well take not less than 10 years. For that reason, I've talked myself about, we need to think of this as a transition, a period where with special resources, with adequate legal tools, you catch up. You do lots of things that you haven't done or you wouldn't have done otherwise in normal times, and above all, you set a path. If that's one of the basic pillars and of the things you want to change, the other one is are the issues around political participation. And what we call, what President Santos has called, breaking the historic link in Colombia between politics and violence. At bottom, what you're doing there is re-establishing a basic democratic rule, which says no one should ever have recourse to violence to advance their political ideas, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we as a government must give the strongest possible guarantees that anybody who engages in politics will not himself be a victim of violence. That sounds like, again, like a very basic and very obvious thing, but it has not been obvious in Colombia over the last 50 years, or in that sense, possibly ever. I think that is terribly important, not just for the evident reasons of opening up democracy, but that if you do that in a country like Colombia that has such a long history of political violence, not just with recent history with the FARC, what you are doing is you're stabilizing the field of politics. you're saying everything that happens within this is politics, and anything outside is just criminal violence. There's no legitimacy for having a recourse to violence. And the other side of that coin is that anything that happens within the system, even whatever, radical opposition, or, if you like, social protest, well, it's playing by the rules. And so it cannot be accused of being part of something else, because that's part of democratic life. So for Colombia, it's of the greatest importance that we manage to, if you like, re-establish that very basic rule. And that's what we've agreed in the second, in point 2 of the agreement, which we finished around November. On the one hand, I won't go into all the details. For those who are interested, we can leave a web page address where you can read all these things. But what that agreement consists of, on the one hand, it has elements of the precisely system of protection, special system of protection for all of those who participate in politics. But then, more ambitiously, it has a whole chapter on different measures to open up democracy, Colombian democracy on paper, and the constitution is very, Colombian constitution of 91 had precisely that as one of its aims, the opening of democracy. But it's one thing to put it in the constitution, it's another thing for this to happen everywhere, especially in conflict-ridden areas. So there are a number of measures to, for example, make it easier to constitute political parties, to finance new parties, to have much stronger electoral guarantees. In fact, to reform the whole electoral system insofar as guarantees are concerned. There's also a chapter on guarantees for social movements. And there's a chapter on increasing citizens' participation, which is another of the promises that came out of the 91 Constitution, but did not materialize adequately. And at the bottom, there's a very simple idea, which is that if you want to build peace, you have to extend voice, and there's no better mechanism, if you think about it, for consolidating peace than making sure that democracy works, that people have trust in the democratic process, they want to engage in it, and they want to defend their views through that process. And the key again to implementing all of these things that may sound quite ambitious is to do it with a territorial or regional approach. And how do you do that? What does that mean? Well, here's where we've been discussing this long with Jim, but this is where we have to think again, learning from our own experience about what works and what doesn't. And the thinking is that you have to, again, use the energy of the peace process to mobilize the population around this, and mobilize them around this institution building purposes. So we've agreed with the FARC already in a number of points to implement things in a very bottom-up participatory way, where there is neither the central government telling everyone what to do, nor the communities themselves on their own running their areas, but working jointly and together. I will come back to that point in a moment. And to do it in a way in which it involves not just those communities, but all the relevant actors in that region, whether businessmen, the church, the local authorities, and at a third level, to really mobilize Colombian society as a whole, to make sure that the universities are engaged in these efforts, that students are engaged in these efforts, as a way to not only help technically with the implementation of what we're doing, but to, if you like, build bridges between what happens in urban Colombia and what will need to happen in rural Colombia. And I know there are a number of Colombian students in the audience. I'm not going to encourage you to give up your PhDs, but I would encourage you to think about what you can do and how you can be supportive of this efforts, because if people like yourselves don't join and think seriously about it, who can do it, who can help? In the end, what we're trying to do is create a new and inclusive model of institution building on the ground. Jim said it, I myself participated in this, and the kind of standard centralized model of institution building in Colombia, I think you can say, is probably exhausted. We've tried over many decades with different kinds of programs to bring public goods, services to these regions, more or less successfully. Obviously the conflict itself has been a major impediment. The very nature of Colombian society and a lack of, you might call democratic interest of the majorities in the cities for those regions is probably part of the explanation. But the fact is, if we keep on going down that path, we're not going to get there. It cannot be the central state landing like a troop of Martians somewhere with technocrats telling people what to do. And on the other hand, as I just said a moment ago, it can't be either the government just handing out money to people and to the communities to do as they see fit, but to find the right marriage between state institutions and local communities in the context of a peace-building campaign to build something new. Now this is, some of these issues, for those who are familiar, and some of the state-building issues were much discussed also in this country in the last decade in the context of so-called counterinsurgency. I myself have never liked the word counterinsurgency because I think it sends the wrong message. But apart from that, this model really is very different from a counterinsurgent model, where, to put it in very simply, you are trying to win over the population to your aims and to take them away from the other. Here, you are trying to build a model that is built on the principle of inclusion and of everyone's strengths joining up for that purpose. Doing things in this way, structuring a transition around a massive participatory campaign, has a number of advantages and benefits. As I said, it would create the energy and bring the resources and to have real effect on the ground, to have a critical mass that you need for real change, which till now has been very difficult in those regions. It would also, and here's an important point, help to solve what I would call the credibility problem. I was reading recently an article by Jean-Paul Lederer that addressed precisely that, and I think he was entirely right. And that is, you are not, in this case, let's assume we're successful. Let's assume we have to implement this program in various parts of Colombia. Now, this is not the first time that anybody in those regions will have seen a Colombian government official telling them that certain things are going to happen. They've been listening and hearing this for the last 20 years, and what they see is a story of promises half kept or not kept at all. So you need to address this credibility problem, and you need to understand that people on the ground are not going to believe you at first, and that there's going to be, as Lederer says, a real problem of distance. And the only way to start solving that is to make sure that those people are, or that the people are part of the solution, that they feel that they're actors, they feel they're exercising their political rights, and that that solution is their solution. That again may seem like something quite obvious in the literature, this issue of ownership and so forth, but there is a real problem that you need to address, that is a credibility problem. And if you do the things in this participatory manner, we think you have a much better chance at a solution. And if you do that, you are, in the end, creating or recreating or strengthening the public sphere in those areas. You're opening up a space for people to interact, and you have the possibility of building bridges both within those societies and between those regional societies and the country as a whole. And if you've been at this long enough as I've been, you do come to the conclusion that peace is about building a bridge. Another reason why I think this is the way to go is that if you do all of that, all of the above, in the end what you are doing is affirming a basic or basic norms in that larger sense of what institutions should help to do. And with this I want to move briefly to the issues of justice. Because in my view, you really have to have this wide-angle view of justice. Many of you may remember what John Rawls used to say when he said that in the larger sense, justice was a fair system of cooperation over time, that was the basic, the organizing idea of justice, and that is really what you have to do to get everyone to cooperate. In some terms that actually Rawls puts in very nicely about what cooperation means. It means that the rules have to be public, that they have to be the same for all, that everyone should have a sense of reciprocity and shared benefits. But if you do that, what you are doing in the end is reconstructing the social order in those regions. And if you take that perspective, that larger perspective of what you're trying to do, then it is easier to deal with some of the great challenges in terms of justice that you're going to have once you sign an agreement. And you're going to have a framework within which to think adequately about how to balance the need to address convincingly victims' rights with the rights of everyone else that has suffered the conflict. So with that, I move briefly to the issues of justice, and I'm happy to take questions on that, on great discussion on transitional justice. And I wanted to say first that there is a problem with this discussion of transitional justice on the whole, because no distinction is made between the classic transitions to democracy that we saw in the 80s in the Southern Cone and in the 90s in Eastern Europe, and what you might call transitions to peace. Normally, all of this is lumped together, and yet there are structural differences. Just as there are some things in common, there are structural differences between moving to democracy from an authoritarian regime and trying to build peace. In the case of peace building, and I apologize if I'm being a bit repetitive, but what you are doing in the end is you're engaging in a collective effort of reconstruction to guarantee that this conflict won't happen again, and to guarantee it on the basis of everyone's rights, including the victims. And you're convinced that it's possible to design a system if you take this broad understanding of what peace building is about. If you have a view that it has to be rights-based, then you have a way in which the different measures of peace building, as I mentioned at the beginning, and those of transitional justice can dovetail in a productive way and reinforce each other. Let me give you a few examples so that this doesn't sound too abstract and airy. Take land restitution. We have the government, President Santos, promoted at the beginning of his government a very ambitious law of victims, that's victims' rights, with a whole chapter on land restitution. Now this program has got going, but it has faced obvious and predictable problems. There have been some security problems, and this is another aspect that we need to take account of. Security in Colombia will remain a problem. We will still have organized crime. We do have the advantage that we have a very professional military and a very professional police force. We've had some serious problems that may be known, but we have the material with which to work, which is the professionalism of the Colombian police and military. And yet, beyond the security problems, we had the problem of precisely how to make sure that the person who gets his plot of land back can do something with it, because there are no roads, there's no system around it to support that land restitution. If that land restitution, which is a transitional justice measure, happens in the context of a comprehensive rural development program, then the chances of that restitution being conducted are much higher. Let me give you a second and perhaps more curious example. We agreed in the agreement on political participation with the FARC that we were willing to create new electoral districts in those peripheral areas of Colombia that suffered most from the conflict, with special rules as to who can be a candidate, who can be an elector, to make sure that the system is not taken over by the existing parties. And that's not a comment against the existing parties, it's a comment about opening up room for new voices. And the purpose of that was, on the one hand, to implement a transitional, because it won't be forever, it will be over a period of time to be established, but let's say 10 years, where you will have new members of Congress who come from those regions, and we think that is a very important measure of political integration, if what you're trying to achieve in the end is inclusiveness and territorial integration in the country. But at the same time, you can see it, and we also see it, as a reparation measure for the political rights of those people who had to suffer the conflict over 30 years and who could not adequately participate. And the third example I would give, and this is something that is yet to be discussed with the FARC, but DDR programs, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs also have to be thought as part of a web of things that happen, and they have to have inbuilt conditionalities that will both support transitional justice objectives, whether it is truth, whether it is reparations, as a condition of the program, and above all conditionalities that will guarantee non-recurrence. That is, Colombian state, the government is willing to do all of these things, provide all of this assistance, but you on your side also have to do these things. Otherwise, the deal is over. And if you do that, you have a much better chance at achieving both effects with regard to transitional justice measures and with regard to peace building in general and non-recurrence in particular. In the end, what you need to do is to have what is called a comprehensive transitional justice strategy. I can talk a little bit more about that during questions, that deals with victims' rights in this comprehensive way, that makes sure that standard justice procedures are complemented by non-judicial mechanisms of truth and reparations. There's already a major reparations program going on in Colombia right now, but again, it'd be a different thing if it happens in the context of a peace-building case. And more importantly, and this is the added point, is not just about, because this is standard discussion, as many of you know, in transitional justice, how do you make sure that the various measures reinforce each other of justice, truth, and reparation. The current Special Rapporteur for Transitional Justice of the UN, Pablo de Colombia, and a good friend, is probably the lead exponent of the idea that these things have to reinforce each other. But what we're saying here is not just that. We're saying that that strategy itself has to be like embedded or nested in a larger strategy of peace building, and that if you do that, the effect both ways will be much higher. Now, to finish, evidently to see through a strategy on this scale, you obviously need political support. And you can ask yourself the question, where is the support going to come from? Many of you may know that the government has publicly committed, and we agreed with the FARC, that we would have some kind of referendum mechanism for whatever we agree. And the view of the government is that whatever we agree in Havana will have to go for a popular referendum where every Colombian will be free to vote whether he agrees with what we did or not. And if you do that, well, evidently you will need to employ yourself as a government in a campaign to explain to everyone what this is about and how, more importantly, it's not something that is being imposed, but it's something that has to be developed, implemented, discussed in the context of this peace building or transition phase. And I think that that would be a source of very significant political support. Obviously of opposition as well, but there's always, your support gets stronger when you have a nice opposition to face. Secondly, I think there's a need to innovate and to think of new kinds of agreements, pacts, regional pacts around this peace-building initiatives, which again are very concrete in the terms of what we did already with the FARC. If you're running a major rural development program in some region, you want people to sit around in some kind of advisory council who come from very different walks of life to see how they can all help with this. And you can be even more ambitious and say, okay, well, Colombia finally after 50 years got over this conflict. Let's talk about some larger issues that go beyond what was discussed in Havana, and why don't we think of some form of pact to make sure that we agree on the way forward. This is a very standard idea in transitions, but I think it would be very important for us. But above all, I think you need to have a vision. You need to be, every Colombian needs to be able to imagine what a Colombia in peace, at peace would be like in the future, and you want every Colombian to want to be part of that and to want to contribute. The burden is on us, the government at the moment, to explain to Colombians that that's what's going to happen, that's what we're doing. But I think we will get there. Thank you very much.
And I would particularly like to thank High Commissioner Jaramillo for sharing your experiences and also for providing us with such an inspiring and well thought out example of negotiating for peace under extraordinarily challenging conditions. I learned so much from your talk and from reading some of the background material beforehand, and was tremendously impressed at the degree of thoughtfulness and consideration that was given to the design of this process. I'm going to keep my comments brief because I'm anticipating some really excellent questions from the audience, and so I want to make sure we have time to hear lots of them. And I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you allowed me to speak with my class coming in to just focus my comments on a couple areas that are most relevant to what we have been discussing in our negotiations class recently. And so we've been talking a lot lately about Robert Putnam's idea of two-level games and thinking about balancing and considering not just your external negotiations, which are the ones that tend to get all of the attention, so the negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC, but looking below that to see within each of those entities what are the level 2 negotiations, and there might be actually many different levels of negotiation, where within the FARC, how are the leaders who come to the negotiation table getting buy-in from their constituents, and within the Colombian government, what are the particular challenges that are faced and the risks entailed when you have President Santos saying, we're willing to negotiate with the enemy. What type of domestic considerations is he facing, particularly within a context where there is this long-standing, highly partisan, deeply emotional conflict with a strong sense of victimhood playing into both sides. And so I want to just highlight some of the aspects of Commissioner Jaramillo's talk that sort of touch on that and really show how important their design process was for this. So particularly, if you are in a position of leadership and you show yourself willing to negotiate with the enemy, you open yourself up to a lot of vulnerability, because there's always the risk that someone like former President Uribe or any other person who is opposed to peace talks, or anyone who is just trying to take you down politically can say you're weak. And particularly if you show yourself willing to negotiate, and then you're in a process of talks and say a kidnapping, a high-profile kidnapping, or another act of violence or terrorism occurs, you suddenly become extraordinarily vulnerable. And so in the design of this, one thing I want to highlight is that you mentioned that you came in with a back channel to the FARC, and you had your first meetings be completely in secret abroad, somewhere else, hidden from the public. And that was a way of reducing some of the risk of taking fallout from some of your internal domestic opponents. And only once you had something to show for it did you present it out to the public. And so, I think that's one very important level. And another aspect which wasn't highlighted as much in your particular talk, but that I also want to mention, is this idea of, well, actually this was highlighted, but back to the secret meetings, the idea of how challenging it is to build trust when there has only been examples of a lack of success before, or a lack of stability. And so thinking about trust, and we see this in a lot of other negotiations. Our class in particular will be studying George Mitchell's work mediating the conflict in Northern Ireland, and the need, when you don't have any trust, to focus the first portion of your meetings not on trying to come to any kind of final resolution or rush to the end or talking about any issues, but really this relentless focus on process and building up a fair process so that people can buy in and gain some trust. And you mentioned that you focused a lot on the method, starting with a single text so everyone could see what was being written, and writing on boards, and really talking about that and setting this larger agenda before you're going to jump in to try and resolve any of the individual issues. And very much related to that is another idea we've been talking about in class, which is that when you try and negotiate over any single issue, it becomes a competition where you have a winner and a loser. And when you are balancing internal and external considerations in this highly charged context, you can't announce an agreement on a particular issue because nobody can afford to make any concessions and be the loser. Everyone has to prove back to their constituents or back to their internal side that these negotiations are worthwhile and they're getting something from them. And so the way that this was set up is, and I want to actually quote from the joint report of the negotiating table, the first report announced in June in Havana, and it says one of the guiding principles of these negotiations is that, quote, nothing is agreed until everything has been agreed. And so it goes on to say that agreements we have been building are conditioned on the achievement of the final agreement of the entire agenda. And agreements reached on each one of the sub-items may be adjusted and added to since all of them are interrelated. And when you do that, you really are creating this large package, and when you create a package, you're giving everyone something they can point to as a win or something good that they can use to sell back to their constituents. And you're also allowing for a lot more possibilities for trading. We talk a lot in class about trading on differences to create value. And so when you open up the possibility of adjusting here to get something over there, you just open up so many more options for the deal. And then I wanted to highlight the aspect that you mentioned of going for this territorial approach. And this is related partially to addressing this credibility problem internally, because you've got to get buy-in not just at the high political levels, but from those people on the ground who are actually going to be living with this agreement. And I'm so impressed with your long-term perspective. You said the point of these negotiations isn't just to disarm, but to really set up this sustainable future. And so if you just disarm and you impose something to the top trying to get that deal, that goes away very quickly. Because soon the interests and incentives people had to engage in the conflict might return. And so taking this long-term perspective of starting in the territories and acknowledging that you need the support of the people at those lower levels of the negotiation chain, that you need to really be benefiting people on the ground and giving them some ownership and some design in the process is an incredibly important way to get their buy-in, and also because they're going to know their interests better than anyone else to actually design some outcomes and some solutions that truly meet their interests and their needs and it's another way to gain their trust. And so we talk a lot in class about the pros and cons of, deciding something from the top down and imposing it, which is very efficient and fast, and you have a lot of control over it, right? But then you don't get that buy-in, versus opening yourself up to the slow and sometimes painful, messy approach of getting a lot of input and allowing a lot of different people to participate, and you lose some control, and it takes a lot of time. It takes years and years and years. And it can be very painful, but it's a long-term investment into getting the buy-in and the trust so that you can have not just this quick thing that goes away, but a really longer-term sustainable solution. And I'm going to take advantage of getting to speak by asking you a question. So one aspect of the sort of multiple levels of negotiation and thinking about whether leaders can really represent their constituents is that you've got sort of internal and external considerations on your own side. Within the other side, usually in big conflicts, and particularly cases where there's one group that's sort of the opponents, right, coming in, some of the leaders are going to be really invested in this conflict because they gain status and power from promoting and perpetuating the conflict. And so I guess one of my questions to you is, how are you going to either neutralize them or give them a role post-conflict so that not just for the good of their people, but for their own personal incentives, they feel invested in achieving peace and giving up some of the power and status that come with being part of this conflict? Thank you.
I'll be quick this time so that more people can ask questions. But no, those were very sharp observations. The first one about the Trustman's idea of two-level negotiation and so forth, that is the essence of our problem, and that is there is an inherent tension, and that relates to the other point about the hidden negotiations. That is, because of the failure of the peace process in 1999-2002, for whatever reasons, it was a very sensitive and tricky thing to propose to the Colombian, or present to the Colombian public a new peace initiative. Most people were not really in 2 years on peace. That on the one hand. On the other hand, you, the government, you really have to hedge your bets, and so do the FARC, and so just be clear about what it is you're going to do. So we needed first to go through that, have first a clear document that this is what we're going to do. That was tremendously important. The fact that the agenda was very clear, that all Colombians knew what this is about, these are the things that are going to be discussed, and everything else is not going to be discussed because it's not on that list. It was a great source of legitimacy and support. It has been so far. The problem is that you start developing this, now the process is well known, it is impossible to do negotiation if you have minimal confidentiality for obvious reasons. And yet, Colombia is a very open country and distrustful of things that happen behind closed doors. So we have a problem, 2 problems, both very serious. One is that we're moving ahead with this, and it's as always not as quick as one would want, but solid and in the right direction. Depends what view you take. Some people say that it's even going quickly. But at home, people just see something that is happening in Havana, appears in Bogota, and fight for it. And in that sense, there's a basic contradiction in what I'm saying between saying this has a territorial approach, but because those communities are the ones who are seeing the least of what's happening because we're out in Havana. And that's something we're starting to work on much more. But again, you always have to find the right balance, which is not easy, about expectations, managing expectations, how much you want people to start thinking that this actually may come to good at a certain moment. That's a tricky one. And then, of course, you have what the classic second level thing of negotiations on each side, which today I think are, without question, more of a challenge than the public ones. We were with Jim, perhaps you may name this, with a very, very distinguished, fabulous American academic who listened to a discussion we had, and very silent, one of the great social scientists of this country. And he listened, And towards the end he said, I thought I came here to hear about the FARC being the problem, but it looks like the problem you have is in Colombian society. So that's absolutely true. If you're interested very quickly on this issue of trust, trust is something that comes from action, not words. So if you deliver, for example, it was very important that we were very rigorous, and if I may say so, professional, in the way that FARC members were extracted from Colombia under secure conditions every time. And so they saw the government said what they were going to do and they delivered. And even in terms of negotiation, the trust is built because you see the other side working seriously and vice versa. And it's very much results-based. It's not just always, it's good to be civilized, respectful, which we are. We're very respectful at the negotiating table. But trust never comes from just being kind of chumming with the other guys. It comes from being serious and from being seen to be serious. On the issue of the package, it's exactly like that. That's actually what President Santos says the whole time. He says, we don't want to say too much about this because it's, the example he uses is like a painting. It's an unfinished painting. Wait until you see the whole package and then you have a different view. But it does present a communication problem because the whole package is not there. So what do you do? And finally, on the more particular question, I want to pick up on that particular question about the buy-in from the leaders and those who are on the ground. Well, that's a very serious question. And I want to use it to just say one word about something that I skipped over right now in the talk, and that is that we have to rethink the way we incorporate a guerrilla movement in the case of FARC. Colombia has been doing this for 20 years, more actually. 25 years has been reincorporating guerrillas and paramilitary groups. And the model is always a classic one. You disband, I set up a program to help you with some economic activity and hope that you find your way into society. I'm not belittling what we've done in the country. These have been programs that have been very well structured, that have cost millions and millions of dollars, probably more than anywhere else, I would guess. And yet, you have to first ask yourself the question, what is it you're trying to achieve? And in this case of this process, if you have a vision that is not just about the FARC, but about inclusion and those territories, and if you learn the lessons of the past, especially of the recent past, and what happened with some of those who demobilized, then you come to the conclusion that you have to do things here, if not entirely differently, at least you have to have complementary kind of programs. And especially that you have to find ways for, in this, what you might call institution building effort in those regions, to make sure that there is a place for some of those demobilized, including senior commanders, so that they become part of the peacebuilding effort. And they see that by mobilizing, they're contributing to this objective with which everyone around is going to agree, and they're part of this effort, instead of being excluded again and finding themselves doing God knows what. And it's not just simply an idea of making sure that doesn't happen. It's to really reinforce the message that this process has to be about inclusion of everyone. There's a little bit of time, I think, so I'm happy to.
My name is Dr. Wilson in the mid-career program here at the community school. Prior to coming here, I was in South Sudan, and I think you know of some of the disruption that's been going on there. 20 years of war, just came out to independence, and they've made some strides similar to Colombia. My question is a question that I see East Africa battling with is transitional justice, where the outcome is strictly peace and inclusion, versus traditional justice, which is what we see taking place with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, where you're placing a blame and you're charging those rebel leaders instead of including them. So I just wanted to get your perspective on those two. How has it played out in the history in Colombia, and what do you think going forward?
Absolutely. Well, that's obviously, but that is the hardest question. And the answer is that it's neither one nor the other. Well, that's an easy answer. So what does that mean? What is, because you cannot claim that there's no tension between peace and justice. There is. You're not going to get full peace. In the case of Colombia, this is something that needs emphasis, and I was also going to say before, but it is a slightly, well, not slightly, I think it is a unique case in the sense that it's probably the first time that in a major negotiation this issue has been at the center. We look at the standard examples of transitional justice over the last 20 years, things always happened in a sequence afterwards. Those parties have been discussed. When things have been discussed, like in the famous case of Sierra Leone, but they discuss it, or in others, it's just simply a general amnesty and everyone's out. And the basic position of the government is there will not be a blanket amnesty in Colombia. There will be a law such as happened in the southern countries that everyone is let off. So what is there going to be? Because you're negotiating with these people, so that obviously you can tell them, well, what's going to happen with you is you're going for 60 years to prison, then they're not going to negotiate with you anymore. But they realize that today in Colombia, and I think it's a big difference, that you can no longer do a credible and serious peace process if you don't have victims' rights at the center of the process. That's what we both agreed, to have victims' rights as a point of the agenda, and to make sure that there were going to be concrete decisions, agreements on what each side was going to do about victims. And that's the kind of baseline. You have to recognize your responsibility, and you have to be willing to do a number of things that contribute towards victims, towards addressing victims' rights. And then the question remains, well, what about punishment, and what happens with the kind of hard edge of justice? Well, that remains to be seen. And it's certainly not off the table. But it depends very much on what happens and how willing the FARC is to actually take serious victims' rights and do a number of things. And I think if Colombian society sees that the FARC is serious, first of all with basic guarantees of non-recurrence, such as giving up their weapons in good faith and remaining legal and so forth. And secondly, that is supplemented by some very concrete actions towards the victims of various kinds. The one that's most discussed in Colombia is truth. Then you can have a different discussion about the extent or what happens exactly with justice. And with that, there are no decisions made. The government has not made a decision because we first need to discuss with the FARC what's going to happen. And when everyone is clear about that, then we can have a much better idea of what happens. So we do think that it is possible, and again, if you take this broader view of what you're trying to do is address victims' rights, and that is part of what I was trying to say, of a larger effort of guaranteeing not just the direct victims' rights, but everyone's rights, especially in those conflict-affected areas. Then you can have a much more rounded view of what the whole thing is about and what your idea of justice is.
Thanks for talking about us today. I really appreciate the presentation. Just first to say, as coming from someone who has a lot of family in Colombia and who has spent a lot of time there and a lot of energy focusing on these issues, I commend and thank you for your work and the work of the delegation in trying to bring about this, as you say, once in a generation opportunity. So thank you for that. I was hoping we could come back to the issue that you discussed about inclusion, and specifically inclusion not only in sort of this ongoing process of transitional justice in Colombia, but inclusion in the negotiations as they are today. There's lots of literature out there about in organizational literature, negotiations literature, economics literature about how important diversity of groups, especially on negotiating teams, is. And you think about the negotiations that are going on right now and the groups that are seemingly not involved at this point, and those are women and youth. Some of the people in Colombia who have been most marginalized and those who have been most directly and indirectly affected by the conflict. As far as I've read, and I could be wrong, but as far as I've read, there aren't any women in the delegation from the Colombian side, maybe one on the FARC side. Correct me if I'm wrong, just what I've read. And as we think about the first two issues that have been discussed, given there's several more, but as the first two issues that have been discussed, which is land reform and political participation, we know women aren't a huge amount of the political participating groups in Colombia. Women participate, I think, in Colombia, 100th or 110th in the world. And in terms of land rights, we know that women don't own very much of the land in Colombia today, nor in the rest of the region of Latin America. So if we think about those two issues specifically, and then, you know, we bring in the question of youth who have been very much influenced by the conflict, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about comprehensive rural reform, and how there's a lot of precursors that lead to the conflict, such as, you know, a lack of economic opportunity in rural regions. I was an MPP student here actually a couple of years ago, and I focused my graduate thesis on the Colombian armed conflict, in partnership with Frank Pearl and the Agency for Reintegration. I think Frank's on the delegation. And I interviewed 120 former combatants from ELN and FARC in 5 regions. And the #1 reason why youth said that they joined the armed conflict was a lack of economic opportunity. And I think that's very telling, and I think that's, you guys are hitting the nail on the head. So I think in light of a lot of these things, I'm wondering, you know, how you are thinking about inclusive measures in the negotiations and beyond, specifically with regards to women and youth, and the efforts that you're undertaking in that regard.
Okay, let me answer that in 2 parts. First, the kind of the general issue of participation in Colombia is very simple, which is not easy to deal with, or let's say not easy to find the right formula. But our view, the government's view, is that this process has 3 phases. We call them phases. The first phase was the secret phase. And because it was a secret phase and we were establishing the terms, the roadmap of what was going to happen, but it was a secret phase. We were trying to understand what the other one thinks, and that's how that works. You reach a framework agreement. Then you have a second phase in which we're engaged now, in which there are various mechanisms to participate, which are, I think, much more important than some people realize. There's a kind of general one, which is we have a web page, and we also set up a system with Colombian mail office so that you can send proposals. Any citizen can get on the internet and send a proposal on any of the points if he wants to. But actually, more importantly, we also agreed originally in the framework agreement that for each point to discuss, we would have what you might call a major conference on that issue in Colombia that has been organized by UNDP and the Colombian National University, which is a major state university in Bogota. And that has worked very, very well. It has produced enormous amounts of information, proposals. It hasn't always been easy to convince everyone to go to these conferences. So you might say that representation is not always as broad as you may want. But it has been very intense. It has helped the FARC enormously to think again about the ideas, and they say this publicly themselves. I'm not patronizing the FARC, I'm just saying what they say themselves. And also, as a process, it has shown people that you can debate some of these difficult issues in a very civilized way. And so we get all those proposals. And they've been the basis for the discussion. But then you have the limits to what you can do. You say, well, if you can do that, why can't you have everyone turning up? Well, because then you can't negotiate. That's how negotiations work. But then there's a third phase, and this is the critical and most important part. And that is that I always say myself that we are negotiating with the FARC the what, not the how. And the how is more important than the what, because it is the reality and the details of how things are going to play out. So you may agree on a rural development program with this characteristics. If on top of that you make sure that that program will, for example, an alternative development program we're discussing at the moment. If you make sure in the agreement that that program will be developed and designed and planned in a super participatory manner, which will be done, then that's actually what peacebuilding is about. And that's why we think, I say, not just rhetorically, that there is a sense in which the peacebuilding begins once you sign. Because that's actually when you start doing things and asking people, what do you think? How should we do this? Where should we do this? And that in the simpler technical, but there are some very complex things we agreed to with the FARC in political participation that were all pushed forward in the sense of saying, for example, Colombia has had a discussion in our own constitution, article, I remember, I think 112, says that the Colombian Congress should produce a statute of guarantees for political opposition. And over the last well, since then, which is now 23 years, it has been impossible to reach agreement on this. And the FARC think, quite rightly, that that's something that should happen if they're moving into peace. That there should be clear, spelled out guarantees for political opposition in Colombia. So here's a rub. That's a reasonable demand, but you as the government cannot say, okay, I'm going to sit with the FARC and determine the rules for political opposition in Colombia. A lot of people are going to be very upset, not just those who are, and not just upset, they're right. This is not about the government and the FARC, it's about anybody, not just the opposition, who wants to participate in politics, you have to say. So what did we do? We said, okay, we have this as a point in the agreement, we've agreed upon this. But the nature of that statute and what it should say and so forth is something that's going to be discussed afterwards with the presence of whichever political party wants to sit there and civil society and so forth. So what he made is a commitment, which is not a small commitment, if you know the problems of this, that this will happen. But the actual, in this case, not just the how, but the actual content is something that's going to be discussed afterwards. Very quickly on the women, we do have now 2 women on our delegation. So it's 2 out of 6 or 2 out of 5. And we also, for example, on political participation, we put a clause at the end that everything that has been agreed upon had to be interpreted as with a gender approach in whatever it is that we agreed to. And I can't go into details about that because that's part of the confidential negotiation, but we're actually taking further steps to make sure that that is the case for everything we do.
Commissioner, thank you for being here as a Colombian. It's actually an honor to have the opportunity to be here. My name is Sarah Velasco. I'm a student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy up the street. My question is in regards, kind of following up with the inclusion comments that you said before, on why the ELN negotiations haven't progressed or started. I don't know what the status is currently, but the news says, have they been left out in the cold? Are they going to be included? And I'd like to hear your comments on the reasoning about the progress of the talks.
There is no reasoning to leave the ELN out. There are efforts underway to do whatever it is possible, and we will see what happens. But there is as yet not a peace process going on with the ELN.
Thank you very much for visiting us and let us understand better the process that is ongoing in Colombia. It's a great privilege and opportunity. My question is probably a more mechanic pointed question regarding the recent congressional elections in Colombia and the results that are there. What is the interpretation that probably you or the government has regarding the implementation of whatever has been agreed? Is there enough political support and it will be possible to implement whatever laws or other decisions that will need to be implemented as a result of the peace negotiations?
I want to take advantage of that question to add a further dimension to your question on the 2 levels and so forth. Because in a way, a real negotiation like this one is not happening just in Havana. Everyone starts adjusting themselves to what's happening. And what you see in that election, this is my own interpretation, is more and more people thinking, my God, this could be real. And so rushing to do something about it. And whether against or for. Not in all cases, but in some. And that's a good thing. Because you've got the setup of all the interests are there. And then what you have to do is make sure that you persuade everyone that this is the way to go. We will have some bitter opposition, but it's much better to have bitter opposition within Parliament in a democratic debate than somewhere else. So we're happy. I think we'll persuade them. Or beat them. One more time.
Well, thank you very much for the talk. And you spoke a bit about a hybrid vision of a central government and local participation in the regions. What does that look like? Can you speak in more detail about that?
Yeah, happily. I know if you say it like that, it sounds very abstract, but this is serious and true, and this already has a fair amount of detail in the agreements. I don't know how. Are you Colombian?
No, but I'm fairly familiar.
Sorry?
No.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you may be familiar. There are certain regions in Colombia where historically there's been no state presence or a so-called weak state presence. It doesn't matter. Just people have got along with their lives on their own, not expecting anything from government. This is a fact. I myself have been there in many such regions. So the question is, okay, well, how do you provide services? How do you get? How do you activate political life? How do you make sure that people feel they're part of equality and that they have stakes? Part of that is, that's how everything interrelates, by the way. If you distribute land, you're giving people a stake and you're activating them. You see that very often. So the question is, how do you do it? And so the sort of this is a caricature, but the simplistic vision we've always had is, well, you get a number of government officials to land there with various programs, and you start doing things. And you start building schools, and you start making sure that teachers turn up, and you improve the local health center or whatever. And again, it's a caricature, but that's the vision. And the conclusion is that that doesn't work, or only partially. And it's not just an issue of getting buy-in. It's an issue of your capacity to deliver. And a larger strategic issue of, until now I want to say, of how interested the country was and the political parties in doing something in those regions. So because of the low density population, nobody was very interested. On the other hand, seen now from a positive rather than a negative perspective, we're convinced that precisely because of the credibility problem I mentioned, but also to make things work, you want to make sure that that organizational capacity, and one thing that's very striking in Colombia for those who have been in those regions is that you very often see, as soon as there is not an imminent threat from some group, you see, and sometimes even with the threat, you see great leadership naturally springing up. So what you want is to use that to build whatever institutional capacity you need, not just them, but you, the government and institutions, with them, with the communities together. And how do you do that? Well, then you have to go through a slightly complex but possible process where you turn up and you do meetings like this one, and you ask people, okay, you're part of now of a regional rural development program that we've agreed to, but we've only agreed to do this program. We haven't agreed anything else except for this broad lines. So what should we do? What do you think are the main needs of this region and its potential and the most urgent projects? And so you get people to engage in discussion, and you come up with a little paper that this is what people think. And then you can mobilize people and technicians and students and others to work in that process and to say, look, for environmental reasons these days, actually this kind of thing, you no longer want to do cattle ranching of this kind here, but there's new things that you can do, and you work with them, and they say, oh yes, no, we like that. And then you start building that into something that looks like a plan, and you don't do it just in one place, you do it in the next, and you integrate all of those things, and then hopefully you will have a healthy budget, and then you decide, okay, these are the things that are most make sense. This thing has been done before. Admittedly, they're very different contexts, but there's some very impressive examples in India and some in Brazil of doing exactly that kind of participatory planning. You're not going to run the whole country like that. You're not going to run the cities like that, because that's not the logic of it. But in those areas, in the transition phase, it is possible to do it. And then, even when you have to actually do things, instead of hiring at high expense some engineers in the main cities of the country to go out there and build something, you can actually, obviously not for everything, but for small roads, even for some small water systems and things like that, you can actually get the communities to engage and not only help building them, but administrate them do something that's very tricky and difficult, which is get people in the countryside used to the fact that you have to pay for public services. So if you're running them, if a cooperative is running it and it's benefiting everyone, then you start solving the collective action problem because it's your water system. You need to pay a little bit to keep it running, and that kind of thing. And it's been done. It's very intensive. It's difficult. That's why we say we need everyone to go and join the effort, but we think it's possible.